Thank you very much for that warm and enthusiastic welcome, Professor Mizukama. Thank you also, Professor Tanaka and Professor Kajita. I thank all my honored colleagues here in the audience for taking the time today to come to hear me speak. I'm very honored, and I hope I will not disappoint you. What I'm going to present today represents some 20 years of work in which I've attempted to develop and clarify some ideas across the fields of psychology and sociology. And as it was just told to you, part of my life's work has been an attempt to bring together the work of psychology and sociology. I've not necessarily been so successful in doing that, but I'm hoping to continue on this, and perhaps I will make some inroads today as well. I think there's much to be gained by bringing the two perspectives together, and hence I consider myself a social psychologist, perhaps a bit more of the sociological persuasion, but also still deeply indebted to the work of psychologists such as Erik Erikson. I'm going to begin by giving to you the original questions that I had in mind some 20 years ago when I started to think about these things. And here are the three prominent questions that I addressed that I thought to myself in terms of developing further research questions to ask. First of all, with regard to higher educational outcomes. So I'm speaking mainly of university level students, and I've taught at universities for 30 years now. It's occurred to me if these students are from similar backgrounds, generally similar social class origins, and have similar abilities, then why are their outcomes so different? What is it that leads to different outcomes? There's no theories available at that time or since that really answers that question. Second, what would we recommend to our children? And I emphasize our children, as in the children we have raised, given birth to, and so forth. What would we recommend to them to do to maximize their life chances via educational routes to adulthood? Now, I'm just going to spend a moment on this because as a sociologist, I have many colleagues who are very idealistic about what they want societies to look like, and they may want a mass egalitarian type of system. They may think in terms of fairly abstract theories of structure and agency, but neither of these is very good for giving advice to their own children, right? So let's be honest, and what would we advise our children to do in terms of the obstacles and challenges that they face? So as advisors to them, what could we tell to them beyond the rhetoric that we might derive from our own academic pursuits? And finally, what can we learn from those who have been most successful in capitalizing on their educational opportunities? And this takes us to the empirical approach to this. So I've studied for the last 20 years the outcomes for those who go through the university system in Canada specifically, but also I've looked internationally somewhat, but my focus is on Canada. And I have some data to present to you later after I get through the theory that shows some of my findings about who does best in this type of system. Now, the type of system I'm talking about has to be taken in context. And I want to emphasize that the identity capital model is a contextual model. It doesn't have universal principles that apply everywhere to every culture, to every situation. I'm applying it to the higher educational sector in late modern societies. So the theory is about late modernity and the life course in general. Many of those who characterize this type of society focus on the ongoing cultural destructuring. Destructuring is simply a form of change, but what it means is that the old traditions are breaking down, the old structures are breaking down, the old norms are breaking down. These societies are capitalist societies, and one of the misunderstandings of capitalism is that capitalism does not require conformity, blind conformity. You often get the image of advertisers wanting people to mindlessly go out and purchase products and this sort of thing. Instead, capitalism thrives on on change rather than conformity. That is, capitalists want the members of society to continually change their fashions, change the little gizmos they buy, change their cars, change their houses, and so forth, because it is a source of profit. And capitalism, by definition, thrives on profit. So capitalism, and there are many forms of capitalism, but the type of form that I'm talking about over the last several decades in late modernity, also known as neoliberalism, has this effect more so than other forms of capitalism. But what tends to get diminished in this cultural destructuring are collective bonds, traditions, and norms. This results in a widespread anomie, or a normlessness, and this goes back to Durkheim, who noticed the same thing happening about a century ago. We find this today, even though it existed in past eras, we find a new manifestation of it. Examples of destructured norms and ideologies would include gender, the meaning of what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a woman. The norms around being a woman as opposed to being a man have changed. The norms around marriage. In Canada, there are virtually no norms around marriage. You don't even have to be heterosexual to get married. You don't have to get married in a church. It's not a religious affair for many people. People are getting married jumping out of airplanes and parachuting to the ground, and that's the ceremony, or they go scuba diving, or they bungee jump. So the whole meaning of marriage has changed. And this helps us to understand the individualization process. When the norms diminish, people fill in for themselves. People fill the gaps. That's part of individualization. We can also see this in the disjunctive links among institutions. The one we're speaking about today is education and work. In Canada and many other countries, we have very expensive education systems, but often they don't lead to any work whatsoever. People graduate in Canada with a high school education, and they're, for the most part, unskilled. They have to go on to further education, and now we're finding at the undergraduate level, many are in the same situation that some were at a few years ago with the BA, that there simply aren't the jobs for them. There's been no central authority or no central organization that's attempted to make the link between education and work, so it's up to the individual to make that link, hence the individualization, compensating for cultural destructuring. And the final example, destructured social markers on the transition to adulthood. And I'm going to be talking today about the transition to adulthood as well as the transition between school and work. And I'm doing this because those two events are interrelated. If someone is having a difficult time making the transition to adulthood, they're likely also having a difficult time making the transition to work. And I'll explain the reasons for that later. So what we arrive at now in the current era is that individualization for many people in many societies is required. It is required that they individualize their life course. The collective supports have diminished, and in certain instances are non-existent. Other instances, they're ambiguous. Now, I'll also talk about instances where other forces come in and attempt to provide new norms, as in the market, popular culture or youth culture, to tell people what to buy, when to buy it, and so forth. So people predicate their identities not around work, but around leisure in that case. I should also say before going on that this destructuring of norms provides more freedom from people, freedom for people, but it's freedom to do things where there are gaps in the culture. So the old constraints against gays getting married, for example, that norm is gone in Canada for the most part. There's still some people who act against it, but the authority of the society no longer enforces that norm, so people can make it up for themselves. But this does not mean there is freedom from the old social structural constraints of social class and racism and gender as much as they exist. There are attempts to reduce these, but these attempts have only been partially successful. So we still live in these societies in which there is a background of social class obstacles, a background of gender discrimination, and a background of racism, depending on the races that you're talking about. Now, when we take this into account, we can also understand how social anomie creates what I call identity market. An identity market is a sphere, a social sphere, in which people interact with each other, not as people with common backgrounds necessarily, not with ascribed identities and long histories and biographies that everyone knows, but mainly as strangers. They come together in the late modern world as strangers in these identity markets. So, sorry, just getting used to this. Go the other way. There we are. So this is a new condition that people face, namely having to function in a society without the collective supports that used to be there, yet they still want to be successful, they want to be happy, they want to feed their children, they want to have houses and so forth. So in order to engage in these markets, the capacities that people have will vary. And there would be the freedom from traditional normative constraints that I just mentioned and the ascribed identities. But these markets have their own norms and obstacles to participation. So there's limited freedom to do something. So the differentiation here is between freedom from and freedom to that the individual must overcome on their own. Now, in overcoming these, there is a serious psychological problem. And this is a psychologist in me coming out. I've just given you a sociological description. But there's the psychological challenges to the individualization process. Not everyone is up to the task. Many people would function perfectly well in an older type of society, but they simply don't have the psychological wherewithal to function in this new type of late modernity. And in my work, what I've done is differentiate along a pole, a continuum. One end is the default response to individualization called default or passive individualization, and at the other extreme is developmental or active individualization. You can just sort of go along with what's happening in the society passively, or you can kind of try to get ahead of it, try to benefit from it. And there are aspects of the society that do create great opportunities for many people. So here are some of the assumptions, and I've sort of reduced this to a formula to clarify it. A plus B equals C, where A is a strategy that a person develops to reach some sort of goal or some sort of end. There's B, the resources that people might have in reaching that end, and C is the end. It's acquiring something. So A would constitute identity investments. For example, who one is, and I put that in quotation marks, and I'll describe different aspects of this shortly. B are the exchangeable resources that people might have, and I'll give some examples of those shortly. C are the accumulated gains in the identity market. So as you make gains in terms of a position in a group, a status, or an organization, so you make your way through the education work transition, and then eventually into a profession, and then the other groups associated with that profession. So some of the strategies go like this, and I'm going to sort of use the simple dimension from proactive being the most effective to inactive, which I'll get to in a minute. Proactive refers back to the developmental individualization that I just spoke about, and here it refers to what is exchangeable for a person to invest in who I am in relation to something, and I give 3 examples here: social status, adulthood. Some people reject moving into adulthood. That's a different story, but other people do. They want to get into adulthood as early as possible, and something may be in their way. Some general goal like financial independence, or a career, becoming a professor. I'm sure very common in this room. The other end of this is being inactive, having no strategy, and just following default individualization, which essentially describes what many people do, especially many young people, when they're following popular culture. Popular culture and youth culture are much the same thing now. If you want to know what to do or who you could be, you simply have to watch the latest movies, latest television, read magazines, buy the latest products, and marketers are willing to provide you with ready-made identities. And this is how the destructuring that I spoke about earlier has been restructured. In late modern societies, we've allowed markets to restructure society. Religions have declined. The family has declined as an authority, and what has stepped in are markets. One of the problems is that these markets do not have any logic related to socialization outcomes. Rather, their logic is about profit. Those markets are not necessarily interested in the good of society. They're interested in the good of the people who own the money and the corporations that make them the money. But that's another story. So the inactive person has no strategies or resource accumulation and simply follows the reinforcement patterns from school to peers, etc. I have many students. I teach at the undergraduate and the graduate level. Most of my students have no idea what they're going to do for a living. They've been in school since age 4, and they're now in their early 20s. They've made no proactive attempts to formulate any long-term goals or to develop any resources to get them to those goals. But they're very happy, and they're following popular culture and have all the latest gizmos and everything. But from an identity capital point of view, they are not engaged in developmental individualization. So my prediction is those are the ones who will not do very well in the long run on their own. Now, some of the resources that we can talk about and that we can operationalize. I distinguish between tangible resources and intangible resources. Tangible resources refer to ascribed identities like parents' social class or parents' networks, gender. You can't choose your gender very easily. You can have an operation, of course, but that's very rare. Ethnicity. These are all ascribed. And these provide people with varying social capital networks. And I want to keep social capital in the equation here. So some people are lucky to have very vibrant social capital networks that constitutes a resource for them in reaching goals. Others are not in those networks, so they may have difficulties. There are also achieved identities. Now, traditional societies, identities were generally ascribed. We've been moving slowly into societies where more and more identities are achieved. And late modernity is one such society. And as I noted, it's possible to achieve identities now because of the normative decline. Nothing is necessarily planned here, but it's simply the space is opened up for people to achieve identities. So more people can get credentials, even from lower class backgrounds. I'm from a working class background. My father was a carpenter. My mother was a factory worker. Neither valued education. And it's this sort of background that sort of led me to think about socialization and development in the way I'm speaking about it today. That in order to become upwardly mobile, for example, you have to develop strategies. You have to acquire certain resources in order to be able to do it. Simply having human capital skills on their own will not necessarily help you, and I'll explain that why. So achieved identities can involve credentials, and these are easier to get for the masses, and that's one of the explanations for upward mobility. Developing human capital, you can develop your own networks, you can develop your own reputation, and you can develop your own statuses. You can set up your own social capital networks, and social capital networks exist in a variety of ways. Intangible resources, there are a variety here, and these are very contextual. I've listed several: agentic, social skills, reasoning abilities. And I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to focus on the agentic attributes because these are the the intangible resources that are most useful in an anomic environment, in the late modern environment that requires people to fill in the gaps in the society where norms are deficient. So I'm going to start with a sort of a series of diagrams to put things together here. And these follow on the last slide with the differentiation of tangible and intangible assets. Some of you may find this confusing if you've read my past work, because some other authors have attempted to argue that identity capital is but one of other capitals like human capital and social capital. What I prefer to do is to include human capital and social capital as types of identity capital, and you'll see why shortly. So what I'm going to do here is sort of, not quickly because we're translating, but move through the various components that add up to give a picture of what's needed for a portfolio of assets in order to function effectively in late modern markets. So skills, there are hard skills like cognitive skills, what you use with your head, motor skills, what you do with your hands. There are people skills, which are social and interpersonal, what you do with other people. But there are also soft skills. These are the skills that are often forgotten in our educational systems. And somebody can be very well skilled, can have a lot of cognitive abilities, a lot of motor skills and so forth. But without these soft skills, that person may remain unemployed or underemployed for their lifetime. They simply don't have the wherewithal to get themselves into those identity markets. So in terms of the agentic skills, I have at the bottom there a list, a partial list: self-efficacy, self-esteem, self and impulse control, purpose and planning. These all relate to functional resources in late modernity. Because of the necessity of moving on your own as an individual between spaces in late modernity, between those gaps, you need these forms of agency in a sense. They are functional in helping you adapt. Now, using the same diagram, again with capitals for engaging identity markets, I'm going to go back to some of the terms we've used already. We have agentic skills, cognitive motor skills, social, interpersonal, and of course, the cognitive motor are really human capital skills. The social interpersonal are really social capital skills, and the agentic skills, as I argued, are in this view considered functional skills. Now, in some diagrams, people might have put identity capital up there, but for these purposes, it's more useful to think of these skills as functional capital. And we start filling these in. So we've got the diagram set here for the market, moving into identity markets where social status becomes very important. You have to achieve a certain social status, whether it be an occupation or some group, and the issue is be included. What constitutes the grounds for social inclusion? And we'll use the example of the job market here. Some skills that are at the soft level, functional skills, your sense of self-efficacy, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this later, self-esteem, sense of purpose, self and impulse control. These are all very important skills for kind of delivering yourself into those markets. Generally, you can't rely on collective supports doing it for you, as was the case in previous generations. There's also, at the level of human capital, there are formal credentials and workplace skills. These are fairly standard. But again, if you could have the credentials and the skills, but if you don't have these other things, you may not be using them at all. At the level of social capital, there are networks. There are people's own networks, and there are their parental networks. But there's also memberships in certain groups. These have always been important throughout much of history. In Western culture, belonging to the Masons, for example, was extremely important in terms of your ability to belong to a guild, to participate in politics, and so forth. There's a variety of these that are left now. They don't have as much of that sort of import, but it's certainly useful. These groups If your parent belongs to one of these groups, those group members are likely to help each other's children find jobs, these sorts of things. So if you put all of these together, you basically get a picture of how all three forms of capital constitute a portfolio that you need to function in late modern identity markets. You have to have the skills, you have to have the contacts, but you also personally have to have the agency. You have to be able to carry yourself into them. For the most part, no one else is going to do this for you. It's just not automatic in many cases any longer. Now, for some empirical research, I've attempted to operationalize this in various ways. With some success. I regret that I haven't, regret that I haven't spent more time on this, doing this, but I have actually worked in three separate fields, higher education, sociology of youth, and identity studies. So for the last 5 years, I've been working in higher education, just finished a couple of books on that, and now my plan is to move back to identity studies. All three of my areas are related, but they're so big, it's necessary to take on big chunks at a time, and now hopefully I'm ready to go back. But in terms of the resources and operationalizing them, now we're going to go from a fairly abstract discussion to a fairly concrete one. I developed about 15 years ago a measure called the MAPS, Multi-Measure Agentic Personality Scale. And this involved taking 14 of the most commonly used personality instruments, numbering in the hundreds of items. And I administered these to a large number of first-year university students and then conducted a factor analysis of them. And one factor came out with this agentic dimension that I'm going to show you. The other factor was sort of a collectivist relational type of factor, but it was not a clean factor, perhaps because of the sample I used. Now, if this study were repeated in another culture, the factor analysis might come out completely different. Or if it was done at another time, the factor analysis might come out completely differently. But here's how it came out. Purpose in life. Here's an example question from it. My personal existence is very purposeful and meaningful. Self-esteem scale, that's the Cooper-Smith self-esteem scale. I can make up my mind without too much trouble. Ego strength, which is quite similar to self-efficacy. I enjoy difficult and challenging situations. Self-actualization, for me, work and play are the same thing. Internal locus of control, what happens to me is my own doing. This is the Rotter scale, the oldest, most widely used scale in psychology. I forget the numbers of studies. I think it's in the tens of thousands. But I just used the internal locus and I put it on a different Likert scale so that it matched the others. And then an identity scale from Adams' measure of identity status, ideological exploration. I've gone through a period of serious questioning about my faith and now say, I understand what I want to believe as an individual. Well, these came out as one factor, these scales, and so I added them together. It was 96 questions by the time you added everything together, which is a bit burdensome. So I developed what I call the MAPS 20, and this scale only has 20 items. So there's 5 from each of those 4 scales, 4 purpose and life items, 4 self-esteem items, 4 ego strength items, and 4 internal locus of control items. I've used this in a multitude of studies, some of which I'm going to talk about. Others I've used elsewhere but haven't published, so I'm not going to talk about them today. But it's turned out to be a very robust, powerful scale in terms of predicting all sorts of things. Now, the other measure that I developed, I originally called the Identity Stage Resolution Index, and I took these items almost directly from Erikson's work, ignoring what Marcia, I'm not sure how many people know the work of James Marcia here in identity status, but ignoring his use of Erikson, I just read all of Erikson on his own, and I culled these items out of what I think he thought was most important for people developing an adult identity. So the reaching adulthood, but reaching it in a robust way in the sense that you have an identity carrying you. This isn't necessarily operationalizing identity in terms of passing social markers, which have in many cases lost their meaning. So there's two subscales here. It's only 6 items for the whole thing, so it can be used in survey research. 1 item, you consider yourself to be an adult, you feel respected by others as an adult, and you feel that you have matured fully. So that's the first scale. Second scale I call societal identity resolution scale, and this involves integrating into a community. For Erickson, this was very important because communities are what support identities. You cannot have a true sense of identity unless you're integrated with a community. And this is one of the misunderstandings of agency, how it's been used, as if you can operate agentically without any connections with others. That's not what I intend or what others have intended with this use of agency. And I'll come back to this a bit later. So the questions here are, you have found your niche in life, that's your place in life. You have settled on a lifestyle that you're satisfied with for the remainder of your life. And you have found a community in which to live for the remainder of your life. I've presented this scale at other conferences, and the big, especially in the States, the big criticism is the wording for the rest of your life. I purposely put that in because that's how Erickson spoke of it. In traditional communities, that's what you did. Once you commit, you're committed for life. Now, in American society, committals are, have a contractual sort of meaning similar to what marriage has or a mortgage. So commitment has a far different meaning now in late modernity than it did traditionally. So a number of studies were undertaken. Here's some findings from the original study. And I'm going to use short forms here, so you have to bear with me. This is maps predicting ISRI over a 2-year period. So the maps measured in first year correlated with the ISRI in third year. So being agentic predicts resolution of the identity stage or developing an adult identity. So in other words, agency predicts integration in this way. This is that same group, but I followed them up over a 10-year period from their late teens to late 20s. So from about 1900 to the year 2000. And the maps, that one scale with the 96 items, could predict 10 years later how satisfied people were with their jobs, how satisfied they were with their personal development, and I put together a scale, which I won't show here, about how well their life is unfolding on schedule, right? If they had future plans and how well those future plans are working out. Their life project, another term, more of a European sociological term. What's your project? What is it your life is about? And the maps predicted this reasonably well. What it wasn't correlated with were parents' income and education. Now, this is probably due to the fact that the sample was somewhat homogeneous in terms of being mainly middle class. Now, had we had a broader social class range of very wealthy and very poor, I'm sure there would have been a difference. But again, back to my original question, within middle class samples, what can we predict? And the key here is agency. Those who are more agentic will do better in the long run. Another study, sorry, this is the same study, but looking at just the ISRI. So the gains that have been made towards developing an adult identity by age 18, what does this tell us 10 years later? Those who had low ISRI, that is, low development of adult identity and community integration at age 18, 19, were still less likely to be in full-time work and still more likely to be in education 10 years later. They're also more likely to be suffering from clinical levels of identity confusion. At 20% of that sample, I introduced a measure in 2000. It had just come out. It wasn't available in 1990. So what this suggests is that those who start or end the teens, who start their 20s at low levels of identity, low levels of agency, do poorly later. It's not something you can really make up, or if you make it up, it doesn't necessarily have the same utility. So rather than sort of postponing, what Jeffrey Arnett is arguing that we just postpone maturation processes. He talks about emerging adulthood and, well, let's just, let things postpone for 20 years. I've been conducting research on that, and what I'm finding is that this sort of thing, those who start off their 20s at low levels of identity generally do much worse. It's much more difficult to come back from that later. And other findings, I did a study with Schwartz from the US, where we compared the maps in the ISRI to identity status, and basically found that diffusion corresponds to how I define default individualization, and achievement to developmental individualization. I apologize for those who don't know the Marcy identity statuses, but this is Erikson's continuum from identity diffused to identity consolidated. So this verifies that aspect of it. Did a study with Arnett, the fellow I just mentioned, where MAPS was used to, was correlated with identity status, style, and various forms of exploration. And we did a cluster analysis, and we found that these clusters showed that less than half of the sample could be characterized as undergoing developmental individualization. That is, they were proactive in their development, and over half were following default modes. They weren't exploring, they weren't developing their identities in the various ways that are considered to be most healthy. And of course, this was replicated across 3 US ethnic groups. In the United States now, whenever you do studies to get the money, you have to study Hispanics, blacks, and whites. And more from Schwartz, again, ethnically diverse American university students. 2006, and he replicated this the following year. Again, the MAPS ISRI connection. Secondly, the MAPS RSI together predict positive psychosocial functioning, which means that those who are more agentic and those who have made greater gains in terms of developing the identity capital of an adult identity had better subjective well-being, and lower depression, anxiety, impulsivity, and tolerance for deviance. Tolerance for deviance means that they were more likely to commit crimes. Now, this isn't exactly transition to work, but if you're in this position where you have poor psychological health, it's quite likely that your transition to work is going to be impeded or suffer somewhat. So that's how the transition to adulthood and the transition to work appear to be interrelated. Some findings from the UK, John Bunner and his associates did several studies. They had a unique data set, cohorts, very, very large cohorts in the tens of thousands who were born in 1946, 1958, and 1970. And they found that as time went on, but especially for those born in 1970, having agentic psychological resources was important for securing employment and preventing social exclusion, the so-called NEET youth, not in education, employment, or training. So something happened with the nature of the labor force for those born in 1970. No longer could they simply be guaranteed of a job to move into factory work, for example, or to move into managerial work. No longer did the social capital networks of their parents help them. So the collective supports were basically gone. And it was more important for them to be able to make their own connections. This is by Lux, study done in Belgium. He found, and these are not university students, these are people in the working world, those who score higher in the ISRI have greater work stability and are more engaged in their work. So the more of an adult identity you develop, the more likely you are to have stable work patterns and greater engagement in the work that you have. And finally, some related findings. Again, Schwartz, a large sample of US university students using the MAPS 20, the measure of agency, predicted better mental health, better social control, less depression, anxiety, impulsivity, and norm violation, similar to his previous findings, and the same pattern obtained across all 3 ethnic groups. Again, Schwartz, 2010, this time was 1,546 U.S. university students, found that the ISRI, or becoming more of an adult, was associated with avoidance of health-compromising behaviors. Again, consistent across those ethnic groups, consistent across socioeconomic status, and it didn't matter whether the person was living with their parents or not. Some might think if students go off and live in residence, they're away from parents for the first time, they might run into these problems, but that was not a factor. So that's essentially the testing of the identity capital model. Perhaps a little bit repetitive, but there's no question of the importance of agency in further development. We certainly haven't found anything in the opposite direction. So it's not like that there are any mixed findings. It's really quite clear that agency has a great value, both in terms of making one's way to adulthood and making the education to work transition. And both of those are clearly related in that, to the extent that you are more healthy, functioning, that has clearly been found to be associated with how well you progressed in terms of developing a sense of adult identity. So there's some sort of protective factor there, and the more you've done that, the more ready you are for work. So it's sort of a matter of work readiness. I'm just going to finish off. I'm going to change things quite a bit here. And as I said, I haven't been working on this model for a number of years, so I'm going to share with you and invite your feedback on this in the question period, some conclusions and speculations about possible expansions of this model. And in one case, I'm going to show you some of the work that's been done, cross-cultural work on self-efficacy. And another one, I'm going to talk about identity economics. It's a brand new field. Akerlof is a Nobel Prize economist, and shortly after he won his Nobel Prize, one of his ex-students came to him and said, "You're wrong. You've missed something. You've missed identity." So I'll try to explain that to you and show how the identity capital model might even enhance identity economics a bit more. So, self-efficacy and culture. Generally, the definition of self-efficacy is the sense that one's actions can produce certain predictable outcomes, similar to agency, but the way they do it is they have a variety of measures. They argue right up front that it's contextual. So you may have a sense of self-efficacy about math, but not one about languages. You may have a sense of self-efficacy as a teacher, but not one as a parent. So it's contextual, and it's difficult to come up with just one broad measure of self-efficacy, although there is one available. But it's better to look at things individually. Now, the paradox here that they found, and they found this in study after study, and this research just started in 1990, and that was about the time I was developing the identity capital model. They started with a cross-cultural application right from the beginning. And here's the paradox. Adolescents in Asian societies, which they call collectivist, have lower academic self-efficacy than those in Western individualistic cultures. But the Asians outperform the Westerners. So why would somebody who has better performance at something, say math is one of them, why would they think less of themselves in this way? Well, their explanation was that self-efficacy is more important when norms, in this case performance norms, are ambiguous or absent. So this goes back to the destructured norms of late modernity, right? To the extent that societies have destructured and norms are no longer relevant or applicable, individuals must fill in the spaces themselves. This is what self-efficacy is really about. It's about the individual developing a belief in themselves that they can do it. So personal agency in this respect must compensate for the ambiguous or absent performance norms. And many people go to school without great expectations of performance norms. I mentioned my own case, working class background. My parents really didn't care about education. They didn't care if I got an academic education. Got virtually no support from my family, no expectations whatsoever of doing well. So to do well basically came from me and my teachers, right? Which is, as I understand it, quite different than the Asian context. So I put together a few things in a few tables, so you have to bear with me, and I beg your pardon for throwing so much at you all at once. But here's a way of sort of formulating this: performance contexts and forms of agency in individualistic and collectivist society. Now, often agency is counterposed with communion, the old agency versus communion thing, where communion is being more relational and agency is being more selfish. I've never bought that definition. I don't think that's that useful. But rather, this gives us some clarity. So collectivist societies and individualistic societies just might have their own forms of agency, which are equally valid, equally useful, but they're in different contexts. So in individualistic societies, we can talk about personal agency. And personal agency will have an internal focus because it's up to the individual to do things. So in terms of the norms that we've been talking about, in an individualistic society, somebody has to compensate for lack of norms and overcome any impeding obstacles related to those norms, whether the norms be out of date and they're still in place or whatever. Individuals can do some compensating. Authority relations, there's much smaller status differences, especially in schools. They're almost horizontal. Teachers and students are very close in terms of status. You wouldn't believe the situation now in Canada and the United States, and many teachers are not very happy about this, but the teacher's authority is open to question, almost entirely open to question. That's beyond the purview of my talk to go into this more, but there's some serious questions about how well this is working there. And in terms of intergroup relations, somebody in the Western context is more comfortable with outgroups because there's a lot of mixing with outgroups in schools, multicultural societies and the like. And the contexts in which they operate have a high degree of uncertainty anyway, so they're tolerant of this uncertainty. It's just a fact of life. You know, every day has a high level of uncertainty because the norms, the rules are simply not there in many cases, and it's up to individuals to fill in. Go to the social agency, and in terms of norms, with the external focus, so the focus is outside the person, with the norms, there's a tendency to affirm existing norms. There are clear expectations that facilitate performances. So the example I gave of my own upbringing, as I understand in Asian cultures, often there's a greater coordination among schools, parents, and children as to what is expected of them, what are their performance norms. So it's very clear to the children what they're expected to do. In terms of authority relations, there's a larger status difference in Asian countries between teachers and students, so the relations are more vertical, and the legitimacy of the authority of the teaching figure is confirmed. So there tends to be more of a focus on in-group maintenance, and there's an intolerance for context uncertainty. So the explanation here is that a lot of the attribution given to performance success in Asian countries is to external factors, whereas in the Western countries it's to internal factors. So that's what's picked up by that self-efficacy scale, that the Asian person believes that their success is not just due to them, but it's due to a lot of other factors in their environment. And they're being realistic in this, as it turns out. Now we take this a little further, become perhaps a little more theoretical. Sociologists love to talk about structure and agency, and we apply this to cultural settings. Along one side, we can have high versus low agency. Along the top, we have normative structure, where the norms are high. This would be collectivist societies. Norms are low. This is individualistic societies. In terms of how we might characterize the different types of agency, I would say that the agency in individualistic society is more proactive. It's more looking into the future, because what exists in the present is problematic, so the person has to strategize, just like with the identity capital model, strategize about what they want in the future and how to get there. So there's more of a compensation for the low degree of normative structure, and that hence the personal agency. In a situation where the normative structure is high, as in a collectivist society, the agency is more of an active agency, which is affirming of existing arrangements, because those arrangements are really quite effective. When you have well-defined norms, it is really helpful to the person in terms of knowing what to do, and hence you get higher performance outcomes. So there's personal agency and social agency. When you go to the low level, in the individualistic society, you'll have inactivity, where the person is merely following the path of least effort. And this is very common. I mentioned this before. All you have to do is follow youth culture or popular culture, and television programs, movies, magazines, songs. Everything is quite willing to tell you who you are, what to do, what to believe, and so forth. You don't have to think at all. There's really no effort involved. Or in the collectivist culture, you can simply be passive and just ritually comply with whatever. All right, I'm going the wrong way again. One final table. This sort of puts it all together when we're talking about optimal agency in a developmental context. So agency can be very good for development in various ways. So the optimal developmental agency in a collectivist society, social agency, would involve duty, obligation, investments in others. We can see that this leads to higher performances. And in the individualistic context, choice, innovation, and self-investment are sort of the optimal developmental form of agency. The one reason for doing this is to get past this thing where many people simplistically believe that in Western culture there's more agency, and in non-Western cultures there isn't. I think there's simply two different types of agency, and both are equally valid and both have their place. So it's not necessarily the case where if people want to pursue the Western ideal of personal agency, that you have to do it in this way, because it has been almost done by accident. It's been done as a way of compensating for the lack of norms that have been caused by the destructive influences of things like capitalism, which had no plan. There is no plan to capitalism in terms of the health of societies. Now, identity economics, this one's perhaps the most abstract. I'll try to do it some justice here, excuse me, in the few minutes that I have left. As you will well know, economists like to reduce things to fairly simple formulas, which I like to do as well. But essentially what they argue is that to understand why someone will make a certain decision, it's not just the old utility model that economists have used based on taste. That is, if they like something, they'll buy it. If they don't, they won't. But these authors argue you have to take into account the identity of the person, the social identity, and then the cultural norms around that social identity. So if someone's a woman, what are the cultural norms around being a woman? And when it comes to making a decision, I have it at the bottom there, the identity utility, what does the person have to gain or lose from making a certain decision? So if you conform to identity norms, if you know what those norms are, and this, say from an advertiser's point of view, you know your demographic, you know who the person is, you know what the norms are around that particular person, you will know what makes them feel good in buying your product, say. So you pitch it in such a way, you advertise in such a way that it affirms their sense of who they are. So they've applied this in various ways. really quite interesting. I just use the example of gender. They also use the example of school and race in the U.S. But in schools, at least in Canadian American schools, not everybody in a high school has the same social identity. They don't all identify with the school. In fact, many of the students disidentify with the school and they form their own subcultures, so which are called crowds. So you may have jocks who are into sports, you may have burnouts who are into drugs, you have the leading crowd who are the most popular students. All of these groups have different norms. So the decisions they make will not be based on whether or not they're going to get the best academic achievement by their actions, but whether or not their actions give them credit with the groups to which they belong. So if you want to increase academic achievement, you have to do something about these social identities that have emerged in schools and do something about the oppositional nature of those social identities. Now, I'll just leave it at that. There's various ways of doing it. In the book, they describe it. Another example they give is the paradox in the United States with African Americans versus whites. Now, you know, they have a very checkered history, but there's still many, many African Americans, especially males, who are really totally excluded from that society. The average African American male has a greater chance of going to prison than to university. In fact, 1/3 of African American males will spend some time in prison. This is in spite of an incredible increase in the standard of living of Black Americans. The proportion in poverty has dropped by 50% in the last 40 or 50 years. There's been a middle class that's arisen. So why is there such a large proportion of Blacks who are totally outside of mainstream culture and, you know, finding themselves in great numbers in prisons, involved in gangs? Young Black males have a short life expectancy in many cities because of gang activities. Well, the explanation here is that Blacks have basically three choices. They can accept white society, which is the mainstream society, since Blacks are a minority. They accept mainstream white society and go in and work, or do what it takes to work there. Or they can remain an outsider and not do any work. They'll attempt to form their own culture. And you find a lot of this, and many of those people who do that end up in prison. Hip-hop culture really promotes this sort of thing. A lot of the Black music promotes shunning American white culture. Or you can be an outsider, but you can go in and work. Now, the problem is both of those options of joining white culture by working within white culture has a cost for identity utility. You feel like a traitor to your fellow Blacks. So the authors of this theory say that something needs to be done to counteract that oppositional attitude between white and Black. And they go into a number of possible ways of doing this, which I can't get into today. But what I'd like to do is to move on and just end by showing that it's possible that what the theory might also need is the interjection of some of the identity capital model. So you would have social identity, identity norms, identity utility, plus identity capital. So those Blacks who want to perhaps integrate but can't, perhaps need to develop something in the way of strategy, something in the way of resources that will, say, go beyond the white ideal, not necessarily internalizing the white ideal, but still work side by side with the white. So it's a matter of developing or projecting oneself into the white world, working alongside, but not necessarily accepting all of that mainstream society and everything that goes with it. But what the identity capital model does seem to add to this, is a form of norm jumping. That is, you don't necessarily have to accept what is there when you go in, because that society in itself is also suffering from cultural destructuring. So the identity capital model could help the black move in and find a comfortable place without feeling that they're betraying others. And according to economic theory, the more blacks who do this, the more comfortable it is for blacks to live in that situation. So as more and more blacks fill the mainstream of American society, the less the oppositional nature of their identity utility prevails. And the authors give the story. They show how this has happened with every ethnic group, pretty much, who has emigrated to American society, starting with the Irish, who were very low and discriminated against, the Italians, the Portuguese, and they eventually, with great enough numbers, came to occupy the mainstream and develop their own space, their own norms. So they were able to do this. But what it requires here is the identity capital or the agency to do that, to make that jump and to get in to share the wealth of the nation, rather than simply judging your actions on whether or not you feel good or bad about your social identity. And the same goes for the educational example. Those who reject the goal of the education system are really handicapping themselves, and this is what many blacks are doing. They're handicapping themselves by becoming very oppositional to what they think the mainstream is. But by developing a more strategic view of what they want in the long run, they can use their agency to project themselves there and more likely to find themselves there. And the more people who do that, the better off everyone is. And I thank you for your attention.